In today's video, I'm going to be showing you some of my absolute favourite tips for getting amazing results in landscape editing in Capture One. Let's start out by taking a look at the shots that we're going to get. So yes, in today's video we are diving deep into Capture One 20. I do love using Capture One. I do also use Lightroom quite a lot, and often I do tend to switch between them both. Capture One has got some really great tools which I'm going to get into, including some things that just aren't available in Lightroom. So let's dive in, and today is all going to be about landscapes. I've picked 4 of my shots that I took on a road trip around Slovenia and Croatia and Italy as well, into the Dolomites. These are shots that I actually took a couple of years ago now. I haven't really done anything with them beyond just editing them up and maybe having them appear on my Instagram. But this is the first time I'm doing anything in them video-wise, partly because I still can't go outside because Scotland's lockdown restrictions are pretty tight. So let's start off first with this shot. This is of a really beautiful lake somewhere in Slovenia that I cannot remember at all. A lot of Slovenia's got this amazing blue water, this like these deep aqua tones. It just looks incredible, and I loved the like the forest covered mountains in the background. Makes it look very jungly. So I thought this was a really great scene. As you can see though, as a raw file straight out of camera, this isn't a great shot. There's a lot that needs doing to this to turn it into something that stands out a little bit more. So I'm going to take you through what I would do as reasonably quickly as I can to make this a better shot. So the first thing that I've noticed with this shot is that all of the main interest in this image is those mountains and a little bit the sky and the sea, which is really focused in the middle of the frame. So I think this shot is going to work very well with a panoramic crop, something that's quite wide and thin. So I actually don't think I've got an aspect ratio for that at the moment, so I'm just going to leave it at unconstrained. I'm just going to manually bring this down to about there, and I'm going to bring this in here. This is rough. If you were going to print this up, then you'd want to stick to a known aspect ratio just so that it fits a frame, but I'm not, so it doesn't really matter. But I also need to straighten it up, and we can do that in Capture One by using the straightening tool and just dragging a line across where we want our horizon to be. I'm not sure, it might be a little bit incorrect because the line of the lake is obviously sort of moving away from the camera and then back around, so I'm not sure that is straight. In fact, no, it's not straight. So let's actually instead, let's use this little tool here. Okay, that's already looking a lot better. And I do really like that crop because we've still got the blue of the ocean. We've still got those dramatic clouds in the sky, particularly in the left of the frame. But our attention is really drawn much more towards the shoreline of the lake and towards those mountains. So we're in a really good place. I'm going to start off then in the white balance panel, and I don't think there's actually loads that I want to do. I like the tint because it's on the greenish hue rather than the magenta. It's really bringing out those aqua tones in the water. As you'll see, if we do move this up into the magenta side, then we start getting a color cast in the sky, which I really don't like. So I'm going to leave that pretty much where it was. May even push it a little bit lower. Something like that works quite well. It is a little bit greenish, but we're going to tweak those colors a little bit more later on. But the temperature in kelvins, I'm not going to touch at all. I actually like that a lot. So let's move on to the exposure panel. I'm going to lift it up just a little bit, but I'm going to counter that by bringing down the highlights in the high dynamic range panel. As you'll see, if I just bring that up and down quickly, all of those highlights are contained in the sky. So we don't want that information being blown out. So I'm going to bring those down, not all the way, about there, looks good. I'm going to raise the shadows because that's going to bring back a lot of that detail in those hills and in the water. So I'm going to bring it up quite a bit. plus 25 on that. Already we're starting to see a lot more punch, a lot more vibrancy in this shot, and I think it looks a lot better as a result. With the others we can play around. The whites, yeah, adds a little bit more pop, so we can bring those up. And the blacks, I'm going to leave down just a very small amount. I'm not going to touch clarity in this because I don't think it's going to add anything to the scene right now. But I am going to go now to the color editor and just play around with the hues and the brightness just a little bit, because most of the water I think is probably going to be contained in the cyan panel. So if we grab that lightness, yeah, as we can see, we can bring that up and down. That's where it's affecting it most strongly. So I'm going to bring the lightness up just a little bit. Let's help brighten up that water. What about the greens? I think I like that we've got this vibrant green. If we bring that down into the yellows, it starts to get a little mushy. So I actually want to go the other way, push that a little bit more into that emeraldy green tone. Not too much, because then everything just starts going a little bit bluey. About there, I think looks good. Those yellows, I don't really want to do much with those. Bring them down just a little touch, just to help separate them from blending too much into the green. I think we might have a bit of a purple cast in the sky still. So if I just go to our purple and magenta and just play with that hue, yeah, as you see, if I push it one way, it goes purpley. The other way, it brings it back into the blue. So there is quite a lot of magenta in that going on in the image. So I'm going to bring that further into the blue, which is just going to help balance the tones overall. I'm also going to bring down the saturation a bit, because I actually don't want much of that color in the sky. I want it to be a little bit more darker and foreboding and a bit colorless. And we can help with that as well by bringing the lightness down. And that's what I want to do with the color editor. Now, one of the things that's great about working with Capture One over Lightroom is that you can work in layers, kind of in the same way you would in Photoshop. So I'm going to create a new adjustment layer, and using the gradient filter tool, I'm going to drag that down to about here. If you press M for mask, you can see where your mask is. So anywhere where it's red, it's going to be affecting. Anywhere where it isn't, it isn't. And as you can see, halfway between is where it sort of fades out. So you can drag this out more to feather out the effect. But we don't really need to do that too much. I'm going to bring it to about there. As you can see, it is red on the tops of these mountains. We don't want that, because we want to only be affecting the sky. So the way we can fix that is by right-clicking on the layer, go to Luma range, and then this is going to let you tell Capture One that you only want that effect to be applied in either the very bright or the very dark parts of the image. In this case, we don't want it in the dark parts, because that is the mountainside. So if I start pulling up away from these darks, start to see at that point, now if I just move that back and forth, that red just starts to disappear from that mountainside, which is exactly what we want. If I bring it to about there, it's all gone. There's no more red in those trees on there. So I know that the only place that this filter is now going to be affecting is my sky. So press apply, press M to hide that mask, and now we can start playing around a little bit more. So I'm going to start by bringing the exposure down, just darkening that sky, upping the contrast just to help add that extra bit of punch. And this is where we're going to add in some clarity. If we apply it to the whole image, it's going to look very crunchy and weird, but clarity is a great way of really enhancing some of those cloud details and adding in a little bit more contrast just to help those darker clouds look even more dramatic and foreboding. So I think that's looking good. Maybe drop those blacks a little bit, maybe even drop the shadows a bit as well. And if we just turn that layer off and on, we can see just how much difference that has made. It's done a huge amount to really enhance those clouds coming in. So I think that's looking pretty good. The next thing I want to do is basically do a little bit of dodging and burning and just selectively brighten up certain parts of this scene. So I'm going to create another new layer, and this time I'm going to use the Draw Mask brush. And I'm going to right click to change the size. I want a slightly bigger size. I don't want it to be feathered as much, but I'm going to be painting in some additional exposure. Now, right now, my opacity and my flow is at 100%, which means that if I add in some exposure now, it's going to apply the maximum amount with every brushstroke. I don't want that. It's going to look quite clearly too much. But if we bring the flow right down to just 2%, that means that with each brush stroke it's only applying 2% of the effect. So that same thing now, it barely touches it. But it means that with each additional brush stroke it builds up that effect more and more and more until you eventually get to 100%. Which is a really great way of dodging and burning, because it means that you can paint in very, very naturally that light without it appearing too obvious. So we're going to leave the exposure at an extra whole stop of light, bring that brush down a little bit, and I'm going to brush it in onto where some of the light is already falling on these mountains, just really enhancing where the light already is. Same goes in the light in the background. Just trying to carve out some of the detail on these mountain sides. A little bit on this side too, and a little bit on these trees. If we just turn it off and on, it's a subtle shift, but it actually makes quite a bit of difference. But I'm going to do the same. I'm going to create another new layer, but this time we're going to drop our exposure, and this time we're going to add in some additional shadow. Basically the exact same thing. Our flow is still at a low level, which really allows us to paint in that light, or rather paint in the shadow, which is just, again, that's going to help carve out these mountains in a way that just adding in contrast generally wouldn't do. It would just look like you've upped the contrast. Doing it this way allows you to really selectively put those highlights and shadows in. So if we turn those both off and then back on, it does make a difference. It really does. It might seem like a very, very subtle shift, and it is, but it's one of those things that when used subtly and when used well, it all kind of builds up to create a much more just a much better effect generally. So I think we're already in a really good place with this shot. If we just have a look at the before and after, Capture One's got this new slidey tool which I really like. Here's our before, and it's very dull and very lifeless. There's not a lot of contrast. It's doesn't really have any kind of pop off the screen, but with the effects that we've made, it pops off a lot more. Those colors are much more vibrant. The sky looks much moodier. So I think we're doing some good stuff with this. But I'm not quite done yet, because I want to have a look at some of the styles and presets that you can get for Capture One. So over here in the Adjustments tab, you can get things like black and white, cinematic, film, latitude, deep forest, latitude sunbound. They've got a whole range. The great thing is that unlike applying a preset in Lightroom, you can apply it to a new layer and then you can adjust the opacity, which is very much how I like to work with presets in Photoshop. Apply it to a new layer and then blend it in with your image, rather than just applying the whole effect, which will just make your shot look like anyone else who may have used that same preset. So I think Deep Forest is probably going to have some good tones, because obviously it's designed for your greens and blues and stuff that you'll find in a forest, and that's what we've got here. So if we just hover over them, we start to see the different effects. I mean, already Crater Lake dark, I think looks pretty good. It is too dark. Let's keep having a look down. I do really like some of these tones. Cascades, I think, looks pretty nice. Yeah, it's quite a lot of these. How I like to work with presets, and I've said this before in a few of my other editing videos, is that they are great for inspiration for your shots. You may have an idea in mind for your shot, or you may have seen a really nice composition, but you're kind of playing around, seeing where you can take it with some editing, and having a good selection of presets is a really handy way of being able to just run your mouse over them, seeing where you can take them. It may give you some ideas that you wouldn't have thought of doing. I really like this dark, this moodier redwood. We could have a look in the Sunbound as well. These are going to give us a completely different look. Again, I wouldn't have taken my colors in this way, which is shifting those yellows of the trees much more into orangey tones. But again, I don't dislike that at all. This Petra Dark is pretty good. Again, not bad. I don't like these quite as much. So let's close that tab. Seasonal. Yeah, again, not so much on those. I'm going to go back to our deep forest, because I really like what it's doing with some of these. In fact, I think my favourite might be Cascades. So what I'm going to do is right-click on Cascades. I'm going to go to Apply to New Layer. So it's now been applied, and if we go back to our layers, we can now see that Cascade is there, which means that we can turn it off and go back to our image as it was before we applied that preset. Because obviously it is very, very vibrant. It's really changed a lot of our colors to quite a drastic extent. The great thing is that we don't have to turn it on and off. We can then bring that opacity right back, starting from 0 and just building up a subtle effect, just enough to bring that bit of pop, somewhere 30%, almost not there at all. If we flick that on and off, we just see, but it adds that extra little bit of pop to our image. The highlights on the trees pops a little bit more, the highlights in the water does. It's just that extra bit of toning, that last step, which just helps polish up this shot a little bit more. So now if we have a look at the before, it looks like this. We've got purple tones in the sky, everything's very much in shadow, and then we bring it across to this. We've suddenly got a much more exciting looking image, which as a holiday snap, I think looks really, really great. So on that note, let's move on to our next one. And it's another shot. This one is in Italy, I think. Is this one in the Dolomites as well? Or this one might be in Slovenia? I cannot remember anymore. I think this one might be in... I can't remember. Cannot remember at all. I'm sure there are a lot of travelers who know exactly where this is and are probably appalled at my lack of knowledge here, but there we go. So I'm going to start out by applying a crop to this shot, because there's a lot of unused space down here where it's just this hillside that I don't really think we need. The focus of this shot is the church, and it's that really big peak in the background. So I'm going to see what it looks like with a 16:9 aspect ratio, that slightly more widescreen cinematic view. It's not quite as panoramic as the one that we used before, but let's just sort of start to bring that in. Yeah, this is sort of what I've got in mind. And I can bring it in this way just to kind of obey the rule of thirds a little bit in having the peak of that mountain in the right thirds, which also puts the church in the left thirds. I'm going to bring it down just a little bit, something like that. We don't want to cut the peak, the tip of that peak off. That would be ridiculous. We want to give it a little bit of breathing room, so I think something like that works really nicely. So let's just have a look. Yeah, I think that looks good. That is pretty much as I want it, but I want to also just adjust the upright proportions of the church, because I think it's squashing in slightly because of the lens I use. So I'm going to use the vertical keystone tools, and this basically allows you to line up some of your vertical parts just like this, and it will straighten them. Oh dear. Okay. I mean, that hasn't worked at all, has it? Right. Let's try that again. Let's go back. Why hasn't that worked then? Is it because it's too narrow? And it's... I mean, that hasn't either. That's Okay, so maybe the keystone generally is not the way to... Okay, right. Let's just go back. Redo our crop. Okay. Good to know. Good to know that the keystone isn't really the way forwards for this. Maybe I could just slightly adjust our rotation, our angle. I think that actually is probably a little bit... That's probably what I had in mind, just kind of making sure that this edge of the building, kind of one of the dominant edges, is straight and the lines going up the tower are on the horizontal. So I think that looks pretty much okay. So straight away, I'm going to have a little play around with the exposure because I don't think I need to do anything with the white balance. The white balance looks pretty much spot on. I think if we start adding too much warmth, maybe a little bit. I always do this, don't I? I say, oh, I'm not going to do anything with this, and then I have a little play, and then here we go. Okay, maybe that's fine. If you hold Alt and click, you can temporarily reset your white balance, and I think it looks fine with what we've done. Let's bring our highlights down because there's a lot of highlights both in the sky and in the church. So I'm going to bring those down there. Our shadows, I'm actually going to bring those down because it's quite a flat image. There's not a lot of contrast in it at the moment. So bringing those shadows down is just going to darken it around the trees and a little bit on the mountain, which I think is already looking good. We can maybe boost the contrast, but I don't want to go overboard because it starts to look a bit too punchy too quickly. So I'm just going to do +7 on there. I don't think there's much else that I want to do on that. I'm going to bring the saturation down just a touch because it's a little bit too punchy. And I'm going to do a little bit more in the color editor. So going into those greens, because we've got quite a lot of greens here. Let's just see what happens if we bring them down. Okay, in this one, I'm going to just have a play around, I think. I'm going to make this one a slightly more experimental. I'm going to bring these greens much more down into the yellows. Before, we tried to keep them quite an emeraldy green, and that would work for this as well. It would give it a bit more of a, a springtime, the hills are alive with the sound of music sort of green tone. But instead, I'm going to bring it down a little bit more, slightly more later summer autumnal tones on these trees. And I'm going to do the same with the yellows as well. Bring those down a little bit. Not too much because it starts to look too unnatural going into those oranges. So, about halfway. I'm going to also brighten up those yellows. And actually, I might do the same. No, I'm going to bring those greens down a touch. The oranges themselves, you know what? I'm going to just bring the saturation of those oranges down because I am. It just looks all right. I can't say necessarily why. Again, if we just hold Alt and reset what we're doing on some of that color adjustment, it's working for me. You might be looking at this yourselves and thinking, oh no, what is he doing? But it is working for me a little bit. The blues, there's a lot of blues. And so in fact, most of the rest of the color tones in the mountains is coming from the blues. I'm going to shift that slightly into the cyan. What's the cyan itself doing? I actually think I'm going to push that a little bit closer to the greens. The greens we've already done stuff with. What about the magentas and the purples? I don't think there's loads. There is a little bit. So we're going to bring those down into the blues. And that's about it there. Okay, that's looking fine. I'm going to add another gradient filter on this sky as we did before. I want to try and make those clouds pop a little bit, but this time I'm going to use it as I'm going to feather the adjustment even more, make it a bit more subtle, because this time we're going to be affecting too much of the mountain, and whereas before the mountains were very, very dark, so we could very easily just not apply the effect to those hillsides. This one, the tones blend in a lot more, so I don't want to go overboard in what I'm doing and affecting that mountain too much. So we're going to have to be a bit more subtle. I'm going to do basically the same things, a little bit of a darken, slightly upping that clarity. And I don't mind that it is affecting the mountain a little bit, because it is helping bring out some of those details. But because we've feathered it off so much, we don't have quite an obvious line of where we've clearly put that filter in place. It's one of the reasons why it's good to kind of play around. You know, you can see very clearly as I drag this down, it applies it further and further down. Whereas if we'd have used the same one we did before, let's just bring it right back up to something like that, it becomes very, very clear that it's applying an effect here and not here. And you need to basically blend it in a lot more. And this is how we're going to do that. So something like this. So it's not applying down here. It's not really affecting the church, but we are just getting it a little bit on those mountains. So it's looking good. Maybe boost that contrast a little bit more. What about bringing the shadows down? Yeah, I think this is good. This is looking all right. Okay, turn it off. Turn it back on. It's really helping just make those cloud details pop, and it's just helping add a little bit of separation actually between the mountain and the background, so that is good. Cool. I am going to now bring another graduated filter in, and I'm going to bring it in just down here, and I'm only going to lower the exposure, just trying to darken off the bottom part of this frame. I'm going to feather it a little bit more by bringing it up there and bringing it down here, and then dropping it a little bit more. The reason being is because that is helping darken. We're darkening the top of the frame, and we've just slightly darkened the bottom of the frame, because down here this is just that grassland. The eye doesn't need to go to that part of the image because there's nothing there except some grazing land for some horses. The focus of the image is that church in the middle, and by using those filters in that way, it allows the eye to go to the brighter part of the image in the middle, and that's where our subject is. So it really does help just put the focus exactly where we want it. So I think we're in a really good place with this image. Again, if we use the before, it's very much straight out of camera. The tones are a little bit all over the place. There's not a lot of contrast, but we've made some slight shifts in our exposure, in our colors, and by using those filters, we're already at a place where we've got a lot more pop to this scene overall. I think it's looking good. Again, this is the point where I would then go into our styles and presets, have a little look through and see if it's something which can just take it to the next level. I'm going to close down latitude and have a quick look through film. You know, I don't dislike that. Let's keep on going. Yeah, you know, some of these filmic effects I think look pretty good. Film 4, I like. FL04, or the -1 in particular, I really like. Let's just let's keep that one in mind, and we'll come back to it. Maybe 6, sort of punching up those oranges a little bit. 8 is too much. 8 is definitely too much for me. Actually quite like that. A little bit more muted, a bit more subtle. You know what? I'm not going to look at the rest. We've been through some of those others. Let's go with film 4 minus. And again, we're going to add it to a new layer. Okay, apparently the film grain in that cannot be applied to a new layer, but that's fine. Don't really want the film grain, so we'll click apply partially. And so there we go. And if we go back into our layers, then we can see that that effect has been applied to a new layer. So we can turn it off, turn it on, see what it's doing. I quite like what it's doing. And then again, we can bring it down if we don't want to apply the whole thing. And in this, I don't think I do. I want to apply more of it than we did the last one, but I think maybe somewhere around 80%. So I just want to just take the edge off, not have it being quite as potent. So that's pretty much, I think, what I would want to do. The last thing I'm just going to try, just bear with me. I'm going to use another draw mask. I'm going to zoom in ever so slightly onto the top of this mountain, zoom out a little bit. And with this mask, I'm going to bring the exposure down, contrast up, and clarity up quite a lot. And I'm just going to I'm going to use a slightly higher flow just to make the effect stronger. Paint in a little bit more detail, basically, on this mountain in the background. I just want some of these details, some of these like rock gullies to pop off the screen a little bit more than they are doing. What about a little bit more contrast? What about if I brought those shadows down? Okay, maybe the blacks down. We don't want to do it too much. Let's go back to fit on screen. Okay. Turn it off, turn it on, turn it off, turn it on. It's okay. Let's go back to our brush, make it a little bit bigger, and apply a little bit more down here, a little bit more on these trees, and maybe a little bit over this side as well. Okay, what about a new one? This time a little bit less exposure. Oh no, too much. Too much. Flow back down to a very small amount. This way we can just paint it in, because I do think it's a little bright, a little bit too much light on this side of that mountain. This is going to help bring that under control. But again, it's every single brush stroke is very, very subtle. I might do a little bit more on these trees just to emphasize those shadows that are there, and just to make it look a bit more like the light is just kissing the tops of those trees. If we turn that layer off and back on, and this one I think might be a little strong, so let's bring this one down to 80%. This one, what if we upped the contrast on this one? Yeah, I think that's looking a little good if we just bring that up to there. I think those adjustments together, I think, is giving it a little bit more pop overall, particularly hand in hand with the preset that we applied. So now, when we look at the before, we've got a shot with colors that are a little bit plain, a little bit, they're fine, but the shot overall is just a little bit bland and lifeless. It's very much a raw image where it needs some work. And our crop has really helped give a bit more of a cinematic focus to the scene, because it's taken away some of that plain landscape at the bottom of the frame, and our edits have made this a lot more dramatic. There's our before, there's our after, there's our before, there's our after. The mountain pops off. There's more detail in those clouds, so we just get that hint that there's interesting storm clouds coming in over the tops of those mountains. Yeah, I really like that. I think that's good. Again, it's a shot that I'm really pleased with. I would have that happily printed. I would put it on my Instagram. You know, would it go in my portfolio of my travel shots? Maybe not. But I think for a quick edit, which this is, reasonably. I don't know how long I've spent on this one so far, but I would still call this a fairly quick landscape edit. But I'm pleased with how it's come out. So I'm going to move on to the next one, and it is this waterfall somewhere else in Slovenia. I'm very sorry that I'm not very good at remembering exactly where these places were, but I have a bad memory for names of places, apparently. So again, starting off with a different crop here. In fact, no, let's start off with by adjusting the angle, because it's obviously taken a slight slant because the water was sort of coming down in the wrong way. That looks almost spot on. The way that this water is falling is very much in line with gravity, and our images do have to obey gravity. No, we're still on 16:9 crop. I don't want 16:9. I'm actually going to keep it with the original aspect ratio, which I liked, but I'm going to bring it in firstly to put the waterfall in the right thirds of the frame, but also because the pond itself, the lake itself rather, is shifted a little bit over to the left, and we've got a lot of sort of dead ground down here, which we don't really need. So I'm going to try and just shift this up, keeping this rock here in the foreground, but trying to bring the focus much more back to the lake and to the waterfall. So I think this is going to do that really nicely. We're going to bring that down to something like that. I think works well. Okay, so we're going to start off by going into our high dynamic range because the exposure overall is fine, but we've got what looks like some blown out bits on our waterfall. So by bringing those highlights down, we can see that that really kind of takes the edge off that. If you bring it down too much, it just goes grey. Loses all its contrast and doesn't look good. So you don't want to completely remove those highlights, but it's just enough to take the edge off it. We are going to go back to that waterfall with some more focus adjustments shortly, so we are not yet finished. Overall, looking at the white balance, I think it's okay. So I'm going to skip white balance. We can maybe add a little bit of contrast. Our shadows, I might actually just bring those down a touch. It's just going to darken these edges slightly, but I'm going to darken the edges even more by, first of all, going into the vignette tab, and I'm going to add a little bit of a vignette because all of the focus of this image is the middle. It's the waterfall, it's this rock, and it's this lake. Around the edge, we've just got the trees and we've got rocks, and certainly down here, as I said before, we've got a lot of bits of rock and bits of old tree. We don't need to see that, and we don't want to darken it completely down and bring in a huge vignette because it looks very, very weird. Vignettes have to be used subtly, otherwise it just looks ridiculous. So, you know, a small vignette, and if we just turn that off and on, it's quite noticeable if you just flick it very quickly, but I don't think you'd necessarily look at that and think, ooh, you've put in a massive vignette. So I think we're okay. The color editor, though this blue in the middle of the pod needs to be lightened a little bit, I think. And I think that's probably in our cyans. In fact, if we move this back and forth, then yeah, we can see that that is affecting a lot of that color. So let's keep it pretty much where it was. Maybe lift it a little bit back towards the blues rather than it going a little bit more of a mushy green. Let's increase that lightness, but also increase that saturation a little bit so it just pops out a little bit more. The greens, actually bringing those greens down into those yellows gives a nice contrast between the blue in the water and the yellow in the tree. So I actually think that looks really good. What about the yellows themselves? Bringing those away. Yeah, that looks good. Orange. Not much. We don't need to do a lot with that. Maybe actually bring some of those oranges out in the saturation, not loads, because if you take it out completely, we lose all the orange in the rocks and in around here, and it doesn't look very good. So again, a subtle approach there, something like that. What about the lightness? Oh yeah, bringing the lightness up. It's a good example just then of why playing around with sliders is a really great way of editing. It might seem like it's all over the place and it's not a very professional approach, but you don't always know exactly what each thing is going to do until you grab that slider and start fiddling around with it. So it's a good way of just experimenting. And originally I thought, oh no, if I darken those down, then it's going to help draw the eye to other parts of the scene. But actually we don't want that, because everything then, the tones all sort of converge together and you lose some of that contrast. So by bringing that lightness up, we're actually saving a lot of detail in those rocks, and I think that looks a lot better as a result. So there we go. If we just turn the color palette on and off, it's giving a slightly more dreamlike aesthetic to our shot overall, and I really like that. I think that's looking really good. So back to our waterfall then. Zoom in slightly. Oh dear, much less than that. Okay, let's just zoom in a little bit. Oh, for God's sake, what am I doing? Back. Let's just zoom in once. Fine. And let's go to our layers, and we're going to get a new layer, and I'm going to use the brush tool. And nothing is changed yet. The first thing I'm going to do, press M to see our brush. I'm going to up my flow a little bit and feather my brush as much as possible. And I'm just going to paint in the mask before we paint in the effect. Press M to hide the mask. Now we're going to be able to play around with exactly the effect we want to put on that waterfall, because bringing those highlights down before did make everything go a little bit grey. So I'm going to up that contrast. But the thing that's really good with waterfalls is adding more clarity, because that really helps pull out the detail on every single individual strand of water. So just look on those strands as I move that clarity up and down. It really enhances that detail in a really amazing way. So I'm going to bring the clarity up to 30. Maybe even a little bit of structure on there looks pretty good. So both of those I'm going to keep on plus 30. What about those highlights? Unfortunately, I do think that I've used quite a long shutter speed. I've used 8 seconds. No, an eighth of a second. I think maybe I should have done half of that speed, or rather half as fast again, because this big amount of water has just blurred into a blanket of nothing. There is no detail, unfortunately, to rescue in there, which is a bit of a shame, because it's now just a flat triangle of white, and I don't really want that. Let's boost those whites a little bit more, and if we just turn that layer off and on, it's just helped bring out so much more of that detail, and the way that every single rock has been brought out, the way the water is cascading over those different rocks. I think that looks a lot better. If we zoom back out, turn it off and on, suddenly there's a lot more detail on there. The waterfall becomes much more the focus of the scene again. I'm going to do another adjustment brush this time. I'm going to bring the flow right down, and I am going to add in some more clarity, a bit less shadow, a bit more white, and I'm just going to start painting that in onto some of these extra rocks around the edge, because we don't want to add tons of clarity to everything, but the texture on these rocks really could benefit from being amped up a little bit, and maybe even some of the water as well. It's just going to help them pop out, and we could see what it looks like to add a bit more. In fact, actually, yeah, extra clarity. The white doesn't seem to be doing a lot, but we could maybe even add a bit of brightness, maybe drop the shadows a little bit more, and just again brush that in on these, not everywhere, but just bits of our scene, and a bit more on the water. If we turn that off and on, we can just see, pay particular attention to the grasses. Right, in fact, let's zoom in just to that area in particular. Off and on, you can just see how it's carving out the detail on those rocks a little bit more. But it's not applying it to absolutely everything, so that it just looks like you've done plus 100 clarity. It's being very specific, and which I think is a really great way of doing landscapes. If you use global adjustments too much in your landscape photography, then it becomes very clear what you've done to the image. But this is much more subtle. This is the scalpel rather than the mallet way of editing, which I think is good. So again, I think I'm at a point with this where I've done most of the edits that I want to do, and if we have a look before and after, we've turned it from I think a decent snap, and we've just we've shifted those colors a little bit, brought out some of that detail, controlled some of that dynamic range in a way which is just making it a little bit more cinematic. It's got a slightly dreamier aesthetic overall. And I think that looks really nice. It's arguably, maybe a little bit more Instagrammy, but that's no bad thing. People want to have, photos that look good on Instagram. So again, this probably isn't a shot I would put in my portfolio, but I think it's looking pretty good. The last thing again, though, let's go into our presets. Let's go into our styles, see if there's a way that we can take it a little bit further. Let's start with Deep Forest again. Oh dear, not the bright. Okay, the bright ones don't work. I actually really like Crater Lake Dark, but it's obviously got a lot of contrast and probably clarity itself, which maybe we could take out. I don't know if we're able to go in and selectively take clarity out. So let's have a look through some of the other ones first, but I'm going to come back to Crater Lake because I think it is probably my favorite of them so far. I don't like that. It's a little bit HDR-y. The shadows have been really lifted. Schwarzwald dark isn't too bad either. It shifted those greens back from the yellow that I took them to, much more into a deep emerald, a foresty look, which I do really like with this. Whereas the Latitude Sunbound, I think, goes the other way and brings it again much more into those yellowy, very orange. In this example, very, very orange tones for those greens, which you know, I'm really feeling the deep emeralds of the first slot. So let's go back to Crater Lake Dark. Or maybe we should actually go with Schwarzwald Dark. Let's go with Schwarzwald Dark. And again, we're going to apply it to a new layer so that we can then go and edit it how we want to. And let's just have a look, see if we can see what it's applied, because I think it's up to the shadows, which I don't dislike, but it's, what else has it done? I think it's probably done a lot in the curves, which I'm not going to try and edit because it becomes very easy to undo everything that it's done. But I'm going to maybe reduce that contrast a touch, and maybe bring the highlights down on there, and then bring down the opacity of the whole layer. If we turn it off and on, off and on, I do really like what it's done. And bearing in mind, our other adjustments are still there, so you know it hasn't overwritten what we've done in our other adjustments. So you know those are still there, which is good. But let's just turn that down. Let's start at 0, and then we build it up, and I think that maybe 70 is the sweet spot, I think, for that adjustment. It's not quite taking it all the way. Yeah, maybe 75. I think that for me is spot on. I might actually just slightly tweak that a little bit more. That angle. I think that is looking pretty good, actually. That is almost everything that I think I want to do. I'm just going to bring in a darker excuse me, I'm going to bring in a graduated filter again in this bottom corner. I'm really going to feather it out, just bring down that exposure, just because there's so much just debris down here. I really don't want it, but I don't want to apply another vignette to the whole image, because then it's going to bring in too much darkness here, too much darkness on this corner, and I don't want it. So I'm just going to do that, and the same again in this corner, just helping bring the eye away from those, less so on this corner, because I do like these rocks, but this side is very much debris. And that, I think, is where I wanted to take this image. And again, we've still got our other adjustments. The waterfall is still helping be brought out by our adjustments there, and same on those rocks. So now if we look at that before, and it's fine, and then afterwards, suddenly it just jumps off the screen so much more. So yeah, really, really pleased with how this shot has come out. Finally then, let's move on to our last one. And this one, very clearly, late at night. Let's immediately, we don't need before and after yet. We'll come on to that. Let's start off by, it is very, very dark. So let's brighten our, first of all, let's brighten our exposure. Let's also bring up those shadows quite a bit, just to really bring out more of the image. The highlights I'll bring back down, and maybe a little bit of contrast just for now. This is another shot where I'm going to do a very, very narrow panoramic crop, kind of like we did with our first one, because the whole focus of this image is the Refugio Locatelli here, the mountains here. This is up in the Dolomites in Italy, and it's a little bit the sky and a little bit these rocks here, but we don't need all of this extra cliff down here, and we don't need all this empty sky. So I'm going to go to our crop tool, and I did notice actually that we do have a 1:3 aspect ratio, and that is we need to swap it around the other way, please. How have I done that? Can we do it this way? There we go. That's how we do it. We just drag it the wrong way. I was doing it wrong. Of course I was doing it wrong. 1:3. That might be a little bit too narrow, actually. So let's unconstrain it and just bring it up a little bit more that way and a little bit more that way. And I want to straighten it up ever so slightly. Or do I? Because I think I might be spot on with this building, actually. So now I'm going to leave that where it is. Here, then, is our shot. Is that sharp on this building? Oh, it is. It just hadn't really loaded in full view. It's sort of sharp. This was at this was a 25-second exposure, so there may have been a tiny amount of shake in my camera at that level, so it's probably fine. But it has got this nice ghostliness of the clouds as they move over the mountains at this point. So 25 seconds is the way to kind of get that motion in place. So I think we're looking okay on that. I'm going to start off with the white balance, because I actually think that because we've still got these sunset tones in the background a little bit, I think by pushing our tint more into the purple is really going to, in fact it already is, it's bringing out that rich purpleness that's in that sky, in that sunset already, and by also adding in a little bit of warmth, extra tint, and just that one shift in white balance has already really brought out so much more of a sunset. Before, it was very cold, quite cold tones, and yeah, you get a little bit of pink in that sky behind the mountains, but now suddenly the whole scene is really being brought into those sunset colors, which I think looks amazing. So that's great. I'm gonna go back into this, and I'm gonna just shift that angle a little bit to, I just think that's a little bit more in line with what it needs to be. It just wasn't hitting my eye quite right. So yeah, that's looking a little bit better. What about our exposure tab though? Because we did have a little bit of play around, but I think we could do a bit more. Just up our brightness slightly. We could even up the saturation a little bit, just help those colors pop out even more. What about our whites? Again, moving them up and down, seeing what they're doing. Up a little bit, I think. And our blacks. Yeah, bringing the blacks down just a touch is great, because it's just darkening down this lower ridge where there isn't a lot of detail anyway. So we don't need tons of stuff going on in there. So again, let's have a look at our clarity, and I think bringing it up to maybe something like +20, this time globally in the whole scene, because the more we add, it's bringing up a lot more of the detail in this rocks. And if we zoom in over here, then we start to see that it's carved out more of this landscape in a way that I think looks really, really good. It is a high resolution image, and sometimes adding in that clarity, maybe even a little bit of structure. If we go too far, then things get really weird really fast. No, let's go all the way back. So just a little bit of structure, I think, is already adding in a good look to our image. I don't think there's much more I want to do. In the color editor, I don't really know how much I want to do, because I like, I don't want to shift those purples into the blues. I like those purples being purple, because that's adding in those lovely rich tones of our sunsets. If anything, I might push them slightly more into the purple. Maybe darken them down a touch, which is just helping boost that saturation. The blues, I'm going to just leave where they are. Same with everything else. I can have a click through, and maybe those oranges I'm going to bring down. It's just helping give a nice richer orange on the lights on the mountain refuge here. But otherwise, I don't think there's much more I really want to do. I'm just going to have a look. This is a test. I don't necessarily know if I want to do this. I'm going to add a graduated filter to the sky. Press M to see it, and I'm going to do the luma range because I don't want it to apply to the mountain. So that is the point, as you can see, where it starts to go away from the mountain. So we're now just applying it to the sky. Click apply, hide our mask. And what if we start to add in some contrast and some extra clarity? Because I want to try and make this cloud here just pop out a little bit more. And I think by upping that clarity, but because we've used that luma range, it isn't applying it to the mountains, it isn't applying it to the hut. It's just applying it to the sky and as cloud, which I think is looking really good. And if we turn it off and on, I do think that's doing a lot. I actually have noticed that it is also applying it a little bit to the mountains. So what I'm going to do is go back into our luma range, display mask, and if we bring it up, so if we start bringing up too much, then it's getting rid of it in the sky, and we don't want that. So I'm going to leave it there, but I'm then going to rasterize our mask, which means that I can then, using the brush tool, I think, or do I need to use the erase mask tool? I need to use the erase mask tool. Slightly bigger size. And if I display our mask, then I can just go in and erase it from the mountain, specifically from where we don't want it. Smaller brush size. Yes, like this. Press M, and then it's displaying our mask again. So now when we turn it off and on, it isn't applying to the mountains at all. I don't mind that it's applying it a little bit to the building, or do I? Let's just take it out and see what it's like. Yeah, that's better. That is better. Yeah, that's good. That's spot on. I'm just going to zoom in on that mountain. Just check that it isn't obvious that we've erased the mask. What I'm looking for is often if you use the masks too much and there's too much of a hard line between where the mask is being applied and where it isn't, you get a weird sort of ghosting artifact or like a halo effect around that, where it becomes very obvious that you've literally just sort of painted in an effect in one place and all painted it out somewhere else. But zooming in on these mountains, I don't think it's very obvious that that's what's happened. So I'm happy with that as it is. What I am going to do, I'm just realizing I'm going to bring my crop in on this side because we've got dead space over here that we don't need, but I also just want the rule of thirds to apply a little bit more to these mountains here in this side. I think that already is a much nicer crop. In fact, it could even stand to come in a bit more. Something like that, which is also bringing this in a little bit more in line. So we've still got a panoramic crop, but it's much more focused on, we've got the clouds here, we've got the mountains, we've got the refuge. A little bit less. That. Yes, that is what I wanted. Okay, let's bring in another adjustment layer. This time I'm going to use the draw mask tool. No, I'm not. Let's try a different one. Let's try the radial filter tool. And this one is going to bring in a big circle. Press M to see our mask, and we can see that it's red everywhere except the mountains. I don't want that. I want the exact opposite. This way, I go right-click, invert mask, and now it's only applying on the mountains. So the effect that we're going to do is only going to go onto those mountains. I want to turn it a bit like this. Something like that is, I think, what I want. But as we can see, it's also applying on the sky. We don't want that either. So we go to Luma range, and this time, instead of bringing it up from the shadows, we bring down from the highlights. And as we do, we start to see it disappears from the bright sky. And when we get to about here, which is getting rid of most of the highlights in our range, it's now only applying to the mountains. So we click apply, hide our mask, and now just play with our tabs a little bit. I want to just slightly up the exposure. I also want to up the clarity. I want to up the whites. How much? Okay, it doesn't do a lot, so I'm going to put in a bit. What about our highlights? Basically, I'm trying to sculpt them a little bit more, give them a bit more contrast without just using contrast, because that's going to also make them a little bit too dark. Brightness. Yeah, just play around. Again, I want it to be reasonably subtle, but I just want them to be a bit more crisp and a bit more there, without them sort of fading away into the mist of the evening. I think that's doing it. Let's just turn that off and turn it back on. I like it. I do. But I'm going to bring the shadows back, because I think it's making it a little bit too bright, and we're losing some of that detail. Without it, they're a bit too dark, and particularly on the tips, I think from that effect we had before, they are a little dark. With that effect, they're brightened up a little bit more. Yeah, I like what we've done, except for just down this tiny little bit here, where it darkens it. So I'm going to get the erase mask tool. I'm going to make it bigger. And do I want to raster? Oh yes, I need to rasterize a mask before I can erase it. And then just erase it from that bit in particular. So turn it off and on, off and on. And I like what we've got there. So let's have again a look at our before. This one is a bit more of a dramatic shift, because before it was very, very dark and it was very, very cold blue tones. And now what we've got is a really lovely sunset scene, but I actually think we could do more with the sunset. The way we're going to do that is by going into our color balance. And now we're going to be able to add some extra colors into our shadows. And I'm going to do this by pulling it down a little bit more in towards our purples. I'm sorry, we're still on. So this is the thing, if you've been working in layers in Capture One and you're still on that layer, as you'll see, this is only applying this effect to that the layer we've just used with that adjustment brush. So it's only applying on the mountains. We don't want that. Let's go back to our background layer, and then we go back to our color balance. And now when we drag it into the shadows, as you can see, it's dragging into it on the whole image, and that is what we want. And so what we want to do is apply some deeper purple tones into our shot, and you can do it by dragging this thing and moving it around, and the closer you get to the outer of the wheel, the more saturated that color gets, and as you move it around, you change the hue. So again, it is a good way of playing around, deciding what you want to do. Do you want to add in those blues? We don't, because that cools the image down. We want to add in some purples to really emphasize that sunset. Not that much. So we're going to grab this tab on the outside and really lower that saturation. Start at 0 and build it up. Build it up. I think around there looks good. And our highlights, I'm going to just try putting a bit of orange into our highlights. Let's try it around there, but let's try pulling it a little bit more into our reds. Something like that looks good. Maybe in our midtones, a touch in the oranges in the midtones as well. Yeah, again, that's helping. That's helping emphasize that that sunset feel. Let's add a little bit more of those in our shadows. Let's just turn that off. So just that color balance. That makes a huge difference to the whole sunset look we were going for. So I think that's a really, really good example. I'm also just going to bring the highlights down generally, because I think our sky is still a little bit bright. Do you know? Let's do that in our adjustment layer again, because I just think we can pull that exposure back down, specifically in the sky, bringing things a little bit more under control. We could do the same with our highlights, again, just in that layer. So now if we go and have a look, drag our before, oh dear, very, very dark, very, very blue. Now it's brighter. We've got purple tones in the sunset. It's looking really good. So let's do, again, have a look at our styles and presets. Now, I think the deep forest is going to shift everything back into blues, and we're going to lose a lot of those tones that we were going for, and we really don't want that. So I think I'm going to start by having a look at film, because I think film might be a little bit better for what we want. Film 05 actually doesn't look too bad, you know. One of the lighter ones. What's that? It's shifting things back. It's getting rid of a lot of that purple that we put in, but maybe we had put in a little bit too much. But bear in mind as well that when we're going to apply this, we are going to bring the opacity down, which is going to balance it with those shifts that we've already made. So it's not going to get rid of our purple, but it is going to blend with it. So let's just keep flow 4, no, was it flow 5 in mind? Okay, but keep on having a look. We're not done yet. Okay, and the rest are black and white. I mean, actually, black and white. Maybe not. Sunbound. What are these? What are these doing? Maybe some of these would look okay. No, I think these are making it look a little bit too bright and vibrant. And again, we're losing some of that sunset appeal that we had. I mean, I don't dislike Blue Bay, or Emily Bay, or Michael Bay. Ha ha ha. That wasn't funny. Ooh, I mean, Angkor Wat. That is very desaturated, very, very moody, but I don't dislike it at all, you know? Okay, let's have a quick look at matte before we make any kind of decision, because maybe this is where we're going to find the tones that we're looking for. Matte 10 isn't too bad. Matte 12. Matte 12 doesn't look a million miles from where we actually started. Okay, maybe what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go with Emily Bay. Apply it to a new layer, a brand new layer, which means again we bring it down. That's what we've done. That's where we took it. And then as we start to increase that, I mean, I don't think it's applying it exactly as we store it, because it's anyway, I don't know what it's doing, but it is, if we particularly, it's bringing out some of the detail on the mountain here, which I really, really like. Just as we push it a little bit higher. I don't want loads. I think around there, off and on, off and on. I think that is looking pretty much spot on. If we have a look at what it's doing with our other adjustment layers, again, that still help keeping our mountains under control. This is working on our sky in a really great way. I think maybe I could just pull back the saturation of those purples that I'd put in as shadows. I think it was a little bit overboard. Somewhere around there, actually, I think looks a lot better. And that, I think, looks like a much more impressive sunset image. We've got beautiful tones in there from the last of the light. And those are tones that were already there. We saw those pinks and purples in the sky. This is just enhancing them, because our white balance of that camera before has meant that everything is very, very cold and very, very blue. You know, you can even see the yellow and orange light on the building there. Has gone into quite a cold tone. What we've done is brought it into a much more, just a much more warmer, sunsetty kind of color palette, and I think it's made a huge difference, particularly as well on the details on the rocks over here, on the mountains. Before, everything is just a bit mushy, and obviously it's very underexposed. And now we see all that detail. We see the footpath snaking away. So you can imagine going from staying in this hut in the middle of these mountains, and then you can now imagine walking down this ridge and into those mountains, following that footpath, which is just great. So I think it's yeah, I'm really, really pleased with how all of these edits have come out, actually, and I really hope that it's been helpful to see how I would do this sort of work in Capture One. A lot of this, particularly everything you've seen me working with layers, working with presets, is how I would have to work in Lightroom and Photoshop. Take my shots into Photoshop, work with layers by applying different effects, and then maybe pulling them back using the opacity sliders or masking out certain effects. But instead, we've been able to do it all in Capture One, which does make for a much quicker workflow. And on all of these, I'm pleased. You know, going back to this lake scene, oh dear, what have I just done? Don't know, ignore that. You know, back to our original shot, it was a fine snap, but we've been able to turn it into a much more dynamic looking shot. With this image, you know, why not, while we're in here, just pull that exposure down a little bit. It's a bit too bright. you know, this now has gone for a bit more of a dreamy looking effect, and I think that's really, really cool. Our waterfall scene, particularly with the style that we chose in the end, I think looks really, really cool. Again, it's a little bit dreamy, a little bit of a fantasy sort of thing, but again, by using those adjustment tools, we've been able to selectively bring out details on the waterfall and on those rocks around here. And then finally, our wide evening mountainscape, I think, has completely been transformed by the edits we've made. So that brings me to an end, and I really hope that it's been helpful to see how I would work in Capture One. I also hope that it's been enjoyable to see how I use Capture One versus maybe how I would use Lightroom. If you are a Capture One user, if you have specifically come to this video because you've maybe searched for Capture One 20 tips, I am going to be doing more Capture One stuff, and please do leave your thoughts in the comments below if you do want to see more of this stuff. I do professionally shoot landscapes, and I shoot automotive, I shoot products, and for the most part I do a lot of my work in Lightroom, but if there's anything in particular that you want to see me do in Capture One, please let me know. I'll take that on board, and hopefully that's something I can put into one of my future videos. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining me. If you have enjoyed the video, please do hit that like button. If you don't subscribe to my channel already, please do consider subscribing. It massively helps my channel grow. It allows me to do more things like this, and I've got a lot more stuff coming up soon. So please, I would encourage you, if you've enjoyed this video, stick around. There's lots more stuff coming. But for now, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.